Hey friends, tonight we're stepping away from the well-known myths and into the quieter stories, tales of the forgotten heroes of ancient Greece. Their names may not be famous, but their paths are just as rich, full of bravery, loss, and quiet triumph. If you enjoy these calm journeys through the ancient world, feel free to like the video and subscribe. And if a name in tonight's story stands out to you, tell us in the comments, what did you like or dislike about it? But enough of that. It's time to get comfortable. Let your thoughts slow down, listen to the lyre slowly fade into the Aegean, and let the stories do the rest. Among the legendary figures of Greek mythology, few were as revered as Diomedes, the son of Tyndareus and Eurymachus, and a prominent figure in the Trojan War. His lineage was one steeped in royal blood, but it was his strength and bravery that would carve his name into the legends of Greek mythology. Diomedes was fierce, but he was not merely a warrior. He was also a strategist, a leader, and a hero whose connection to the gods would shape the course of the Trojan War. Born in Argos, Diomedes was destined for greatness from the moment he took his first steps. His father, Tyndareus, was the king of Sparta, and his mother, Eurymachus, was a noblewoman. Despite being the son of royalty, Diomedes was not raised in the lap of luxury. From a young age he was trained as a warrior, learning the ways of combat, strategy, and leadership. He was often described as being stronger and more fearless than his peers, and as a young man he quickly earned a reputation as a warrior who could hold his own against the greatest of foes. However, it wasn't just physical prowess that set Diomedes apart from his contemporaries. He was a man of intelligence and wit, equally skilled in the art of warfare as in the subtleties of diplomacy. His ability to read the battlefield, to make decisions under pressure, and to inspire his comrades made him a formidable leader, one whose influence extended far beyond the battlefield. In the great story of the Argonauts, Diomedes' role was crucial. Though he was not one of the original members called by Jason, his inclusion in the crew was no accident. His skills as a warrior and his deep understanding of battle tactics made him a valuable asset to the quest for the Golden Fleece. His reputation as a fierce, strategic leader preceded him, and his presence was essential when the Argonauts faced numerous trials. As one of the few mortal heroes who had the favour of the gods, Diomedes' path was shaped by divine influence. He was often guided by Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, who took a special interest in him due to his courage and tactical mind. At various points in the Iliad, Diomedes is shown receiving direct assistance from Athena, who would empower him during battle, even allowing him to see and confront gods, an ability few mortals were ever granted. Despite this divine connection, Diomedes never saw himself as a mere pawn of the gods. He understood that while the gods played a role in his fate, it was his own strength, wit, and leadership that would define his legacy. Throughout his life, Diomedes would prove to be both a hero of tangible might and a master of the strategic mind, navigating the complexities of war and diplomacy with a blend of honour and cleverness that set him apart from his peers. When the Trojan War broke out, Diomedes was among the first to step forward and offer his services. His bravery in battle and his ability to inspire others made him one of the greatest warriors of his time. But Diomedes was not content to simply fight on the front lines. His journey would take him to the heart of the Trojan conflict, where he would become one of the most legendary figures in the war and one whose name would echo through the ages. Among the many heroes who joined Jason on his quest for the Golden Fleece, Diomedes quickly established himself as one of the most formidable members of the Argonauts. His reputation for bravery, courage, and strategic brilliance spread across Greece, and his presence on the crew brought an added weight of authority to the journey. It wasn't just his physical strength. Though he was undeniably one of the greatest warriors of his time, it was his ability to lead, to outthink opponents, and to bring unity to the group that truly set him apart. The Argonauts, though an exceptional group of warriors, were often faced with challenges that required more than just brawn. The Golden Fleece was not going to be handed to them. To succeed, they would need a combination of strength, intelligence, and a bit of divine intervention. Fortunately, Diomedes was equipped with all three. He was one of the few heroes in the group who could combine wisdom with action, and often found himself in positions where he could guide the group with his knowledge of battle strategy. One of Diomedes' first key contributions came when the Argonauts encountered the Symplegades, the clashing rocks. These massive rocks, which constantly moved toward one another, would smash anything in their path, making it nearly impossible for any ship to pass through unharmed. While Jason was the leader, Diomedes was the one who suggested the key solution. They would need to timing their passage perfectly, using the momentum of the ship and the current to slip through the rocks at the exact moment they separated. When Zetes and Calais, the winged brothers, took to the air to scout ahead, it was Diomedes who led the charge, guiding the Argo through the gap in the rocks at just the right moment. Thanks to his strategic foresight, the Argonauts sailed through the deadly strait without a single casualty. Diomedes' calm, focused leadership had saved them once again. Throughout the journey, Diomedes continued to prove his worth in ways beyond battle. When the Argonauts faced the Sirens, Diomedes knew that raw strength wouldn't save them. Instead, he recommended they use Orpheus's music to drown out the Sirens' deadly song, while ensuring the ship remained on course. His understanding of the broader picture, that strategic thinking and unity were key to their survival, made him an irreplaceable ally. His abilities were also called upon during the retrieval of the Golden Fleece. When the Argonauts reached Colchis, the fleece was guarded by a terrible dragon, a beast of massive proportions. While many of the heroes were focused on finding a way to fight the dragon, it was Diomedes who suggested that they outsmart the creature instead of engaging in direct combat. He helped orchestrate a plan to use distractions, timing, and a well-timed attack by Medea to finally overcome the dragon. Once again, it wasn't raw power but intelligence and teamwork that led to their success. Though Diomedes wasn't the most vocal member of the Argonauts, his actions spoke louder than words. Whether it was through his calm leadership, his strategic mind, or his ability to outthink enemies, Diomedes demonstrated that there was more to being a hero than just fighting battles. His wisdom, cool-headedness in crisis, and ability to make the best decisions under pressure made him a critical figure in the Argonauts' success. As the Argonauts continued their perilous journey toward the Golden Fleece, Diomedes' strength and leadership had been tested many times. But it was the final stretch of their voyage, the approach to Colchis, the land where the fleece was kept, that would prove to be the greatest test of his life. Upon their arrival at Colchis, the Argonauts found themselves not only facing physical challenges, but also divine obstacles. The fleece was not a mere treasure guarded by mortals. It was an artifact of immense divine power, and it was guarded by both monsters and gods. The land was ruled by Athens, a king with a dark reputation for cruelty, and the quest to retrieve the Golden Fleece was seen as an affront to his divine authority. The challenge of retrieving the fleece was compounded by Athens' demand. In order to claim the fleece, Jason and the Argonauts would have to perform a series of nearly impossible tasks. They were required to yoke 2 fire-breathing bulls, plough a field with them, and then sow it with the teeth of a dragon. Tasks that had already claimed the lives of many men who had attempted to retrieve the fleece before them. Diomedes had always been confident in his strength and wisdom, but the tasks ahead seemed insurmountable. Jason, while a capable leader, did not have the brute force necessary to accomplish the first of Aethys' demands. It was Medea, the daughter of Aethys, who offered them a lifeline. She would help Jason by giving him a magical potion to protect him from the fiery breath of the bulls. At this moment, Diomedes faced a moral dilemma. He had always believed in the idea of personal heroism, that a warrior should fight through his own strength, that success was a matter of individual effort. But with Medea's magic about to tilt the balance in their favour, Diomedes began to question, was it honour to rely on magic, or was it simply clever strategy? As they approached the task of ploughing the field, Diomedes was torn between his innate belief in brute strength and the realization that divine intervention might be necessary. Was he a hero only if he did things by his own hand, or could his true heroism lie in working with the divine to accomplish their task? His moment of doubt came when Medea's magic helped Jason control the fire-breathing bulls, allowing them to complete the task with minimal effort. The bulls had been fearsome, but Jason had completed the task in part thanks to Medea's help. Diomedes began to feel a sense of insecurity about his role. He had always been the one who relied on his own strength and skills, and now magic seemed to offer a shortcut. Is this what it means to be a hero? Diomedes wondered. Am I nothing without my sword? If I rely on magic, does that make me weak? The true turning point for Diomedes came when the final trial approached. The dragon guarding the golden fleece. This beast, a fierce, serpentine creature, was far too strong for even the greatest of heroes to defeat head-on. Diomedes had always prided himself on his bravery and honour, and this would be the true test of whether he could still hold on to those qualities. It was Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, who appeared to him in a dream and gave him guidance. She reminded Diomedes that true heroism wasn't just about fighting battles with physical strength or unassisted courage. It was about knowing when to accept help and strategically using the tools at your disposal. Athena did not see Medea's magic as a form of weakness. Rather, she saw it as an essential resource that would help the Argonauts succeed. Diomedes woke with a new sense of clarity. He realized that heroism wasn't about pride or individual glory. It was about understanding the bigger picture, about working together with the gods and the people around you. Diomedes understood now that even the greatest heroes were not invincible on their own. A true hero knew how to embrace help when it was offered, wisdom when it was needed, and collaboration when the stakes were high. In the battle against the dragon, Diomedes was no longer alone. He fought with the Argonauts, but now, instead of relying only on his own strength, he also used Medea's magic to distract the beast and allow Jason to seize the golden fleece. This was a pivotal moment in his development. Diomedes had grown to understand that strength wasn't just a matter of personal prowess. It was a matter of wisely using the tools at your disposal, including the help of others. After the golden fleece had been secured and the Argonauts had escaped the clutches of the dragon, Diomedes found himself wrestling with a deep internal conflict. The battle against the dragon was a victory, but it had come at a cost: his ego. For so long, Diomedes had believed that strength and individual courage were the only true markers of heroism. The influence of the gods, and the fact that Medea's magic had played a crucial role in securing their victory, left Diomedes feeling somewhat displaced. In the quiet moments that followed the triumph, as the Argonauts sailed toward their return journey, Diomedes spent long hours alone, contemplating the true nature of heroism. He had always prided himself on his ability to conquer enemies, lead armies, and act alone when necessary. Yet, he now realized that his self-reliance had limited his vision. For the first time, he acknowledged that heroism wasn't just about power or victory. It was about growth, adaptability, and the ability to work with others toward a common goal. The battle against the dragon had forced Diomedes to confront an uncomfortable truth. He had relied too heavily on his own abilities and hadn't given enough thought to the greater team effort. While he was capable of great acts of valor, the reality was that no single hero could succeed alone. Even in his greatest triumphs, the contributions of others had been just as vital. The magic of Medea, the wisdom of Orpheus, and the strength of Heracles had all played essential roles in ensuring their success, and in the end it was teamwork, not just individual valor, that had secured the golden fleece. But even as he accepted this, Diomedes still struggled. Was he still a hero if he didn't win by his own strength alone? Had he lost his place among the Argonauts, those who relied on their courage and self-sufficiency? The thought of relying on others, of allowing others' strengths to carry him, was difficult for a hero who had always fought alone, earned his place, and won on his own terms. Yet, as the Argonauts sailed further from Colchis, Diomedes began to understand that his true strength had always come from the group. He realized that he had never been alone. In every battle, in every trial, he had been part of a team that brought together the best of every hero's abilities. His leadership, courage, and wisdom were crucial, but they were not enough without the support of his fellow Argonauts. One evening, as the Argo sailed through the quiet waters of the Aegean Sea, Diomedes stood at the bow, his mind full of thoughts. The night sky was clear, and the stars shone bright above him. He had come to a decision. Heroism, he realized, was not about being the strongest or the bravest. It was about growing, about learning from others and using those lessons to contribute to the success of a shared mission. Diomedes turned to Jason, who stood beside him at the helm, and spoke in a quiet voice, full of newfound humility. "I was wrong, Jason," he admitted. "I thought a hero was only someone who could stand alone and fight. But now I see that real heroes are the ones who know when to lead, when to fight, and when to listen to those around them." Jason smiled, his respect for Diomedes deepening. Every hero has their moment, Jason replied. It's not about being perfect. It's about learning, about knowing when to step up and when to step back. Diomedes nodded, grateful for the insight and for the opportunity to grow. He understood now that heroism wasn't about achieving glory in isolation. It was about the journey, the decisions made along the way, and the lessons learned from the people you travelled with. The Argonauts had become more than just a team. They had become a family, each person contributing something essential to the whole. From that moment on, Diomedes stepped into his role not only as a warrior, but as a leader who understood the importance of collaboration. He would fight when the time came, but he would also listen, guide, and learn from others. The trials that had once seemed like burdens were now opportunities for growth, both for him and for the team. Diomedes had found his place among the Argonauts as a true hero, not one who fought alone, but one who knew how to embrace others' strengths, and in doing so become even stronger himself. After the Golden Fleece was secured, and the Argonauts completed their perilous journey back to Iolcus, Diomedes found himself in a very different place from when the journey had first begun. No longer the young, brash hero who had sought to prove his strength and courage through sheer force, he had evolved into a wise, humble, and collaborative leader. The tribulations and challenges he had faced on this journey, not just against physical monsters but within himself, had shaped him into a hero of depth, not just in bravery, but in wisdom. As the Argonauts celebrated their success in Iolcus, Diomedes was no longer seeking individual glory or accolades. He was proud of the role he had played, but more than that, he was proud of the journey they had all shared. He had found, for the first time in his life, that heroism was not about seeking glory, but about contributing to something greater than oneself. He was no longer the lone warrior charging into battle. He was part of a team, and their success was a reflection of the unity they had built together. However, despite his inner growth, Diomedes' journey was far from over. He understood now that the true test of heroism was not in the moment of victory, but in the lessons you carried forward. He would continue to face new challenges, both external and internal, but he was no longer the self-doubtful warrior of his early days. Diomedes had learned to embrace others, to grow from their experiences, and to be vulnerable enough to accept help when needed. As the heroes disbanded and returned to their respective homes, Diomedes was not immediately hailed as the greatest warrior. Yet those who had travelled with him knew his worth, and in the years that followed, Diomedes became a legendary figure not just for his physical prowess, but for his leadership and wisdom. He was no longer the hero who acted alone. He was the hero who knew that strength came from knowing when to fight and when to rely on others. His legacy spread across Greece, and younger heroes sought him out for guidance. They wanted to understand not only how to win battles, but how to become true leaders. Diomedes became a mentor, teaching them the value of collaboration, the importance of humility, and the necessity of reflection. His advice was simple but profound. True strength is not in how hard you can hit, but in how well you can lead. One of Diomedes' greatest moments of legacy came when the next generation of heroes, particularly Nestor, Teucer, and Achilles, looked to him for wisdom during the Trojan War. His experience in leadership and his understanding of strategy made him one of the most trusted voices in the Greek army. He was called upon not just to fight, but to guide. Achilles, in particular, respected Diomedes' ability to control his rage and act with precision, rather than acting purely out of brute force. In the Iliad, Diomedes was often noted for his bravery, especially in the face of the gods. In the middle of battle, Athena gave him the ability to see the gods, and even confront them. He did not flinch in the face of divine intervention. Instead, he stood firm and took the battle to the gods themselves. He wounded Ares, the god of war, a feat that many heroes would never dare to attempt. But even in this moment of great triumph, it was not just the physical victory that mattered, it was the fact that Diomedes had learned to act with wisdom, not just raw power. Diomedes' actions during the Trojan War were those of a man who had understood the complexity of war. He knew when to strike and when to retreat, when to lead and when to follow. The gods themselves came to respect him, not because he was the most powerful, but because he was the most thoughtful and measured in his approach. Diomedes had become the paragon of leadership, showing that heroism wasn't just about physical dominance, but about strategic thinking, honor, and knowing when to take risks and when to act in the greater interest of the team. As the Argonauts returned to their respective homes and their legendary journey came to a close, Diomedes found himself at a crossroads. The Golden Fleece was no longer the prize. It was the growth he had undergone throughout the journey that stood as his greatest triumph. He had learned to work with others, to rely on the strengths of his companions, and to embrace wisdom over blind courage. And though his fame would never rival that of Heracles or Jason, Diomedes carved a unique place for himself in the annals of Greek mythology. As a hero whose legacy was shaped by his ability to adapt, mentor, and lead with both strength and humility. When Diomedes returned to Argos, he was hailed as one of the greatest warriors of his generation, but it was his strategic mind and his ability to inspire those around him that truly set him apart. While he was still respected for his bravery and battle prowess, it was his role as a leader, both on the battlefield and in times of peace, that earned him the deepest respect among his people. He became known not only as a warrior, but as a wise counsellor, someone whose advice was sought by younger heroes looking to prove themselves. Diomedes' influence was felt most powerfully during the Trojan War, where his leadership became crucial to the Greek army's success. Achilles, often considered the greatest warrior of the Greek forces, respected Diomedes not only for his skill in combat, but for his ability to guide others, particularly in the heat of battle. Diomedes was no longer the brash young hero who had once acted impulsively. He was now a mentor who understood that victory came from not just strength, but from thoughtful decisions made in the moment. In the Iliad, Diomedes is often depicted as one of the most skilled warriors in the Greek army, but it is his moments of wisdom and self-reflection that truly stand out. For example, when the gods intervened on the battlefield, Diomedes stood apart from many of the other warriors, choosing to fight against the gods who had sided with the Trojan forces. His bravery wasn't in his ability to conquer gods, but in his willingness to stand firm in the face of divine opposition, showing that his strength lay in principled action, not in the pursuit of individual glory. One of his greatest feats during the Trojan War came when Diomedes, empowered by Athena, was able to see the gods in battle and even wound Ares, the god of war. This act was a remarkable feat, not because of the physical damage he caused to a god, but because it demonstrated Diomedes' deep understanding of tactical warfare. He didn't simply rely on raw brute force, he understood when to exploit weaknesses, when to take risks, and when to step back and assess the situation. But Diomedes' true legacy wasn't just in the battles he fought or the enemies he vanquished. It was in the mentorship he provided to younger heroes, especially those who would go on to shape the future of Greece. Nestor, Teucer, and even Achilles looked to Diomedes for advice, recognizing his ability to think beyond the immediate conflict and to see the larger picture. In their eyes, Diomedes was not just a warrior, he was a strategic genius, someone who could make sense of even the most chaotic situations and inspire others to do the same. The Trojan War itself was the ultimate proving ground for Diomedes' evolution. By the time the war reached its peak, he had become a pillar of strength not just for his combat prowess, but for his strategic insight and leadership. He helped shape the Greek war effort not by leading with pure force, but by instilling a sense of cooperation among the warriors. He was a leader who valued unity, understanding that only by working together could the Greeks hope to bring an end to the war. Even after the Trojan War, Diomedes' legacy continued to influence future generations of heroes. His story became one of balance, teaching others that heroism wasn't about being the strongest, but about knowing when to fight, when to lead, and when to trust in the strength of others. He had lived through the most legendary battles of his time, but it was the lessons he imparted that truly made him one of the most respected figures in Greek mythology. In the world of Greek heroes, where every warrior seemed to be born with either a magic sword or divine parentage, Ajax the Greater was like the bouncer at the door to heroism. He wasn't just big, he was huge. You know the type of guy who walks into a room and people stop mid-conversation just to say, "Whoa, did a mountain just walk in?" That was Ajax. Born to Telamon, king of Salamis, and Hesione, the daughter of a Trojan king, Ajax was destined to be the biggest guy at the party, the one who always had a snack in his hand, and the one who could break a shield in half with a single flex. Okay, maybe a slight exaggeration, but you get the idea. As a kid, Ajax wasn't exactly the quiet, bookish type. Imagine the Hulk after too many energy drinks. That was Ajax, running around and breaking things. His dad, Telamon, was also a warrior, which meant that little Ajax had no chance of being anything less than the toughest kid on the block. And of course, Ajax's training didn't just consist of swordplay and shield drills. No, he had to learn the ancient art of carrying around a shield so big that it could probably double as a small island. It was almost as if Ajax was destined to be a walking, talking fortress. His oxhide shield became the stuff of legend, and the only thing bigger than his shield was probably his ego, but in a very charming, I'm the biggest, but I'm also the nicest kind of way. Now, Ajax didn't just get his legendary bow and huge shield by accident. He was granted Heracles' bow, yes, that Heracles, the guy who could kill a lion with a look. Philoctetes, a fellow hero, was supposed to be the new owner of Heracles' bow, but when Heracles decided he had better things to do than, not die, he handed the weapon off to Ajax, marking the start of Ajax's real rise to hero status. His bow wasn't just any bow, it was divinely crafted, and probably had more power than most gods themselves. But Ajax, he just thought, yeah, seems like a pretty solid addition to my already ridiculous arsenal. When the Trojan War kicked off, Ajax the Greater was like, alright, time to show these Trojans what a real warrior looks like. He wasn't just showing up to fight, he was showing up to dominate. On the battlefield, Ajax wasn't just the guy swinging his sword, he was the guy who would bop you on the head, leaving you wondering if you'd just been hit by a flying mountain. His shield was so big it practically had its own zip code, and the mere sight of it caused Trojan soldiers to drop their weapons in sheer awe. In fact, Ajax could have probably won the war by simply standing still, his shield blocking all the Trojan arrows while he casually took a nap. As a hero, Ajax was the no-nonsense type. There were other heroes who were all about their fancy speeches or playing the godly charm game, but Ajax, he just showed up, swung his big sword and said, let's get this over with. His philosophy was simple. If you wanted to defeat a Trojan, you hit them until they couldn't stand up anymore, and that's exactly what Ajax the Greater did. He swung his giant sword with efficiency, not finesse. He was the blue-collar hero of the Greek army, working hard, barely breaking a sweat, and walking off the battlefield like it was just another Tuesday. But Ajax's greatness wasn't only about his physical strength. No, what really set him apart was his honour. He was a man of principles, a guy who believed that being a hero wasn't just about crushing the enemy, it was about doing the right thing, whether that was defending his comrades or sticking to his word. The only thing more massive than his body was his sense of justice. However, it wasn't all smooth sailing for Ajax, because, well, there's always that one guy who has to get in your way. For Ajax, that guy was Achilles. Achilles, who was also big, strong, and had a god backing him up, had a tendency to steal the spotlight. Ajax wasn't the type to let his ego get in the way, but it did create a bit of a friendly competition. While Achilles may have been the flashier hero, Ajax had the brawn, and his shield became the embodiment of no-nonsense heroism. If there's one thing that can be said about Ajax the Greater, it's that he didn't waste any time trying to impress anyone, he just did his job, and made sure everyone knew it. The Trojan War had its fair share of flashy heroes. The ones who like to make dramatic speeches before plunging into battle, or the ones who sparkle in the sunlight while they fight. Ajax, however, was more of the, I'm here to punch stuff and go home kind of guy. When the Greeks landed at Troy, Ajax wasted no time making his presence felt. While other warriors spent hours preparing and strategizing, Ajax was already charging in, swinging his enormous sword at anything that moved. It didn't matter if you were a Trojan soldier or a hungry horse. If you were within reach, you were getting hit. He didn't care about getting fancy kills or looking heroic. Ajax had one mission, destroy stuff, and he did it better than anyone. The Trojan War was like a badly organised family reunion. Lots of screaming, arguing, and people trying to one-up each other. Achilles, of course, was the family favourite, the guy everyone wanted to have over for dinner, while Ajax was the slightly more underappreciated cousin who didn't need the spotlight to show everyone who was truly the strongest. Sure, Achilles had that godly edge, but Ajax didn't need divine intervention. He was all about the brute force, and that was enough to get him noticed. One of Ajax's biggest feats came when the Greeks were under siege and things were looking bleak. Achilles, the hero of the hour, had pulled out of the fighting, thanks to a little bit of a temper tantrum typical, leaving the Greeks in a bit of a bind. Ajax stepped up, his giant shield raised high, ready to defend his comrades. He didn't care about the glory, He cared about the mission, and the mission was to keep the Trojan forces from overrunning the Greek camp. The Trojans didn't expect Ajax to stand alone against their might, but that's exactly what he did. For hours, Ajax defended the Greek camp, standing his ground as the Trojans surged forward. It was like a blockbuster movie, with Ajax as the reluctant hero who simply would not go down. He didn't need a fancy speech or a cool sidekick. He just needed his shield and his raw power to keep the Trojans at bay. Ajax was, in essence, the hero who brought back the simple heroism of just do your job. While the Trojans were able to breach the walls of Troy at some points, Ajax was there, steadfast, never faltering. If he couldn't win the war, he was at least going to make sure the Trojans knew they couldn't win without him. The epic shield battles between Ajax and the Trojans became legendary, and the Greeks started to realize you could not win this war without Ajax on your team. Despite his unquestionable skill, Ajax's role in the Trojan War was also defined by his loyalty to his comrades, particularly to Agamemnon. Though he could have easily stepped into the leadership role and claimed the title of the war's chief commander, he humbly accepted his position as one of the great warriors. For Ajax, it wasn't about the title, the power, or the fame. It was about fighting the good fight. That's not to say Ajax didn't have his prideful moments, though. When it came time for the Greek heroes to choose their champions in the contest for Achilles' armour, Ajax and Odysseus were the main contenders. Ajax understandably thought he should get the armour. After all, he had been the rock for the Greek army, keeping things together when everyone else was busy acting dramatic. Odysseus, the man of words and cunning, ended up winning the armour, which to Ajax felt like a slap in the face. In the end, Ajax didn't need the armour or the prizes. He was already a hero in his own right. But that didn't mean he wasn't a little miffed by the politics of the battlefield, because let's face it, Ajax wasn't just a mighty warrior, he was also a guy who knew he deserved some credit. When you've been the one holding the line for most of the war, a little recognition doesn't seem too much to ask, does it? The Trojan War had reached its peak. The Greeks were worn, weary, and desperate. Their best warriors, Achilles, Odysseus, and Ajax, had fought for years, each carrying the weight of the conflict in different ways. But even in the midst of such grueling warfare, one moment would change Ajax the Greater forever: the contest for Achilles' armour. After the tragic death of Achilles, the Greeks found themselves without their greatest warrior. A decision had to be made as to who would take Achilles' place in terms of not only leadership, but also his weapons, most notably his magnificent armour. The armour, forged by the gods, was a symbol of divine favour and immense power. Ajax, who had been steadfast and unyielding throughout the war, assumed that the armour was his by right. After all, he was the one who had been standing firm on the front lines when others had faltered. He had defended the Greek camp, led battles, and fought like a man possessed. It only seemed fitting that he should be the one to wear Achilles' armour, to honour his fallen comrade and carry on his legacy. But Odysseus, the brilliant tactician and master of words, also claimed the armour, arguing that his cunning and intelligence had been key to many of the Greeks' victories. Ajax wasn't just upset by the decision, he was furious. It wasn't that Odysseus didn't deserve honour for his contributions, it was that Ajax had been in the trenches, had bled for the cause, and in his mind, Odysseus had been playing politics to get what should have been his. When Odysseus was chosen as the victor of the contest, Ajax's pride took a hit. It wasn't just about the armour, it was about recognition. Ajax, for all his strength, humility, and honour, had an ego that could be bruised. He believed he deserved to be honoured for his actions. For him, the armour was the ultimate symbol of his place in the war, a place he had earned through sacrifice, bravery, and the sheer fact that he'd never backed down. Feeling betrayed by the very people he had fought for, Ajax fell into a dark place. His internal conflict turned from frustration to humiliation. He struggled with the feeling that honour in the war had become a political game, and he was losing to someone who, in his mind, had played that game better. In his grief and anger, Ajax began to spiral. He felt that if he wasn't a hero to the Greeks, then he wasn't a hero at all. He had no place in a world where merit was overshadowed by political manoeuvring and manipulation. His sense of self was crumbling, and he felt like his identity was wrapped up in others' perceptions of him. In a desperate moment, Ajax retreated from the Greek camp, driven by thoughts of vengeance and revenge against those who had wronged him. He became disillusioned with the war, feeling that it no longer held the same purpose for him. The notion of honour, which had guided him for so long, had been twisted and corrupted by the actions of those around him. Then came the turning point. In the middle of his rage and self-pity, Ajax considered taking his own life. He felt alone, betrayed, and stripped of the one thing that had made him who he was, his honour. But in the depths of his despair, a vision appeared. It was not a god who came to him, but rather his own inner voice, reminding him of what had truly mattered in his life, the battles fought, the comrades who stood beside him, and the honour he had always carried with him, no matter the circumstance. As he stood on the edge of despair, Ajax realised that true heroism didn't come from external recognition or rewards. It wasn't about the armour, the glory, or the fame. It was about the choices you made and the integrity you carried in your soul. The armour wasn't going to change who he was. What mattered was that Ajax had always been a hero in his own right. He had fought for the right reasons, had defended the Greek cause, and had done it all with honour, even if no one else could see it. But in his final act of defiance against his pain, Ajax did something that not only changed his fate, but that of the Greeks as well. In the wake of his conflicted emotions, he gathered himself and confronted his own demons, and he came to the heartbreaking decision to take his life, not out of shame, but as a way to demonstrate the cost of unacknowledged honour. Ajax the Greater was dead. The news rippled across the Greek camp like a storm. The soldiers, the leaders, and even the gods, who had always seen Ajax as a giant among men, were shaken by the sudden and tragic loss. His death was a staggering blow, not just because of the loss of a great warrior, but because it represented the soul-crushing reality of war, where even the mightiest heroes could be undone not just by the sword, but by pride, betrayal, and internal conflict. In the Greek army, Ajax was a symbol of unwavering loyalty and strength. He was the one who had held the line when Achilles had withdrawn, the one who fought tirelessly, not for personal glory, but for the greater good of the Greek cause. He was a force of nature, unstoppable on the battlefield, yet beneath the armour and brute strength, he had always carried a sense of honour and principle. His heroism was rooted in his sense of duty to his comrades, and his willingness to stand alone if necessary for the greater cause. Yet, in the end, Ajax's death was not the heroic battle death one might expect for such a legendary warrior. Instead, it was the product of internal turmoil, a loss of honour, a crushing blow to pride, and a desperate act of finality. His decision to take his own life was a reflection of his mental fragility, a soul-searching moment where his own honour could no longer reconcile with the actions and politics of his fellow warriors. In the wake of Ajax's death, the Greek leaders, especially Agamemnon, Menelaus and Odysseus, were forced to reckon with the consequences of their actions. They had always relied on Ajax to be the unquestionable protector of their forces, the indomitable hero who could not be swayed by personal grievance or ego. Now, in his absence, they faced not just a military void, but a moral one, a loss of trust, a reminder that even the strongest of men were vulnerable to the toll of war. Agamemnon, the commander-in-chief of the Greek army, had often been at odds with Ajax over leadership, but the loss of Ajax forced him to see the cracks in the Greek army, the internal fractures that had existed even among the greatest warriors. It was now clear to him that, despite their strength, the Greek leaders had failed to protect the mental well-being of their heroes. Achilles had already left the war in fury over his insult regarding Briseis, and now Ajax, who had been loyal to the core, had died because of a sense of humiliation and betrayal. Agamemnon, for all his tactical genius, had failed to see the human side of war, the emotional cost that came with constant battle, public recognition, and personal glory. While Odysseus had been the more politically astute and cunning hero, he could not escape the weight of Ajax's death either. His intellect had won him Achilles' armour, but now, with Ajax's death, he realised the real price of that victory. For all the honour that Odysseus had earned in his leadership, he could not help but feel a sense of guilt. He had beaten Ajax in the contest for Achilles' armour, a contest Ajax had felt was his by right, but the reality of the situation haunted him. Odysseus' triumph felt hollow, like a victory that had been bought at too great a cost. Ajax, with all his humility, had been the hero the army needed, and Odysseus wondered if the price of that armour was worth the loss of a warrior who had been so vital to their success. The Trojans, who had fought long and hard against the Greek forces, were not without their own sense of loss. While Ajax was certainly their enemy, even they knew the value of such a formidable foe. There was a mutual respect between the warriors, one that went beyond the boundaries of the battlefield. Hector, who had once faced Ajax on the front lines, admired the Greek hero's strength and resolve. Ajax's death was felt on both sides of the war. For the Trojans, it wasn't just a matter of victory. It was the loss of a warrior whose bravery had forced them to fight harder than ever before. In the Greek camp, the reaction to Ajax's death was a mixture of grief, shock, and guilt. The Greeks gave him a heroic funeral, but no amount of ceremony could erase the reality of the loss. Ajax the Greater had been the bedrock of their defence, and now that he was gone, the weight of his absence loomed large. His shield, once the symbol of their strength, now became the symbol of the price of honour and warfare, the sacrifice that was required for victory. As for Ajax's legacy, it became a tragic yet powerful symbol. His story was one of valour, but it was also a stark reminder that war was not just about the physical battles, but about the mental and emotional toll it took on those who fought it. His tale echoed through the years, resonating with future generations of heroes who would learn from his downfall that honour, while a noble pursuit, could also be the very thing that broke a man. In the future, heroes like Heracles, Achilles and Diomedes would not just be known for their strengths, but also for their mental resilience, understanding that true heroism required balance, self-awareness, and the courage to face one's inner demons. In the wake of Ajax the Greater's tragic death, the Greek army was forced to confront the deep emotional cost of war. The hero who had once been their strongest defender, who had stood like a wall against the tide of the Trojan forces, was no longer there. His absence was felt deeply, not just by his comrades, but by the entire war effort. His shield, the emblem of his strength and honour, was now a symbol of the true cost of war. It wasn't just about the battles fought, but about the mental battles heroes faced long after the dust settled. The Greeks gave Ajax a heroic funeral, as befitted one of their greatest warriors. His death was not forgotten, and his burial was marked with rituals, eulogies, and an outpouring of grief. Odysseus, who had competed with Ajax for Achilles' armour, was among the most affected. Though he had won the armour, he knew that the price of Ajax's death was far steeper than any victory in battle could ever be. Yet it was Odysseus, the master of words, who recognised the true significance of Ajax's life and death. In a moment of reflection, he acknowledged that Ajax the Greater had been the very heart of the Greek war effort, the one who had held their defences together when Achilles was withdrawn from battle. Odysseus saw that Ajax's story was a lesson, that heroism wasn't just about strength, glory, or the ability to fight. It was about the ability to endure, to face the worst of yourself and still stand for what was right. Ajax had done that. However, the Greeks also realised that the price of Ajax's death went beyond honour and grief. His tragic end forced them to reckon with the emotional toll that warfare took on their heroes. Agamemnon and Menelaus, the leaders of the Greek forces, knew they had been negligent in understanding the psychological needs of their warriors. They had been so focused on victory that they hadn't stopped to consider the mental resilience their warriors needed to maintain. Ajax, like Achilles, had been mentally scarred by the war, but his scars were different. His honour had been his burden. He had carried it alone, and it had ultimately broken him. In the years that followed, Ajax the Greater became a legend not just for his physical strength, but for the tragic nature of his story. His tale became a cautionary one. It was a reminder to future heroes that the true battle was not just fought on the field, but in the mind. The greatness of a hero was measured not only by the fame they garnered or the battles they won, but by their ability to cope with loss, to live with honour, and to find strength in moments of weakness. The next generation of heroes, especially those like Diomedes, Teucer, and Achilles' son Neoptolemus, would be influenced by Ajax's story. They would understand that victory came with costs, physical, emotional, and spiritual. They would carry Ajax's legacy forward, but not just through their swords and shields. They would remember him as the hero who had been the best of them all, but who had ultimately been brought low not by Trojans, but by the weight of his own honour. His death taught them that no hero was invincible, and that mental resilience was just as vital as physical strength. Teucer, Ajax's brother, was among those who carried his legacy forward. Teucer, who had seen Ajax's might on the battlefield and understood his mental struggles, swore to uphold his brother's name. Though he never attained the same level of fame as Ajax the Greater, he would always be remembered as Ajax's legacy, standing as a hero who did not repeat his brother's tragic fate, but embraced the lessons that Ajax's life and death had imparted. Ajax the Greater's story also resonated in the broader scope of Greek mythology, where he was remembered as one of the greatest warriors to ever fight in the Trojan War. His tragic end became a symbol for the high price of war, a reminder that even the mightiest heroes were not immune to the psychological toll of battle. The Greeks would continue to fight, but they would also acknowledge the cost of their struggle, not just in terms of lives lost, but in terms of the emotional cost borne by those who survived. His shield, once the emblem of his strength, became a metaphor for the burdens that heroes carried. It was no longer just a symbol of protection and defence, but also a reminder that strength came with the responsibility to look after the mental well-being of those who fought for it. Ajax's death forced a change in how the Greeks viewed their warriors, not just as tools of war, but as individuals with their own struggles, needs, and traumas. Did you know that ancient Greek ships, while not exactly known for their luxury, had an intricate system of navigation based largely on the stars? While today we may rely on GPS or Google Maps, Greek sailors used the night sky to guide their way, trusting in the constellations to lead them through the turbulent waters of the Mediterranean. One of the greatest challenges, however, wasn't just the navigation. It was the constant threat of storms that could wipe out entire fleets in a matter of hours. This constant battle with the elements was especially felt during the infamous Trojan War, when even the mightiest heroes found their fate tied to the whims of the gods and the unpredictability of the sea. Among those caught in this conflict was Diomedes, a king whose story, though often overshadowed by the likes of Achilles and Odysseus, carried with it a tragedy of its own. Born on the island of Crete, Diomedes was the son of Deucalion, the king of Crete, and a descendant of Minos, the legendary ruler who trapped the Minotaur in his labyrinth. Crete, during Diomedes' time, was more than just a rocky island in the middle of the Aegean. It was the heart of a civilization that excelled in trade, art, and innovation. But no matter how powerful a kingdom might be, no amount of wealth or grandeur could ever protect it from the unpredictable tides of fate. Diomedes grew up in the shadow of the legendary Minos, tasked with maintaining the grandeur of the Minoan Empire. But while Minos had built a kingdom of mythic proportions, Diomedes found his own path on the battlefield rather than the throne room. As a young man, he was no stranger to the harsh realities of leadership. He knew that power, though powerful, could also be fragile, easily swept away by the chaos of war. And when the call to arms came for the Greek world to unite against the city of Troy, Diomedes could hardly refuse. Duty called, and he was ready to answer. For Diomedes, the war wasn't just about the glory of battle. It was about honouring the traditions of his people, and, more importantly, keeping the honour of his royal lineage intact. He gathered his forces, donned his armour, and prepared to leave the shores of Crete. It wasn't just the fate of his island at stake, it was his legacy. His forces, though smaller than those of some of the other Greek leaders, were well trained and fiercely loyal. Under his command, the Cretan warriors were known for their discipline and bravery. But little did Diomedes know, as he sailed from the shores of Crete, that his journey would not only be a test of his military skill, but also of his moral strength. The gods, as always, had their own plans. The Trojan War was no ordinary conflict. It was the kind of war that reshaped the course of history, where gods interfered as often as mortals, and where heroes rose to prominence on the battlefield not just for their courage, but also for their wit and the favour of the divine. As the war raged on, the Greek army found itself relying on every ounce of its strength and resourcefulness, and one leader in particular would emerge as a central figure, Diomedes, king of Crete. Diomedes had entered the war not just as a warrior but as a king, a leader with a heavy crown to carry and an even heavier responsibility. While the other Greek commanders were well known and had achieved legendary status in their own right, Achilles for his near invincibility, Odysseus for his cunning, and Agamemnon for his authority, Diomedes carved out his own reputation, mostly through the strength of his leadership and battlefield prowess. What set Diomedes apart, however, wasn't just his skill in combat, though he was no slouch with a sword. It was his ability to lead his men through some of the most difficult and dangerous situations. Throughout the 10 long years of the Trojan War, Idomeneus consistently proved that he was not just a soldier, but a commander who understood the larger strategies of war. He was a tactician, often called upon by Agamemnon to lead critical battles or to take charge of difficult positions. While Achilles' rage and Hector's bravery were known to everyone, Idomeneus earned the respect of his peers by keeping his cool under pressure. His men followed him not because of his bloodline or his fame, but because of his calm and unshakable presence. In the midst of chaos, when Greek warriors were charging into battle or retreating in confusion, Idomeneus remained focused, issuing orders and making decisions that kept his forces intact. His leadership in such dire situations made him a cornerstone of the Greek army. The battle that solidified Idomeneus' place in the annals of Greek history came during one of the fiercest encounters in the Trojan War. In what is known as the Battle of the Ships, the Trojans launched a relentless assault on the Greek fleet, hoping to destroy it before the Greeks could even think about returning home. It was a situation of absolute peril, as the ships were crucial to their escape, and the Trojans seemed determined to set the entire fleet ablaze. At this moment of crisis, Idomeneus stepped forward. With the tide of battle threatening to turn against the Greeks, he rallied his warriors, leading them into the heart of the fray. His courage and sheer will to protect the fleet inspired the men under his command to fight with renewed vigour. It wasn't just the Greeks' superior weaponry or armour that saved them, but Idomeneus' leadership in the face of annihilation. He understood that battles were not won merely by brute strength, but by unity and purpose. As a result, the Greeks managed to turn the tide of the battle, forcing the Trojans to retreat. But even in the heat of victory, Idomeneus faced challenges that went beyond the battlefield. While his warriors respected him, they began to notice that his unrelenting focus on victory, his almost obsessive pursuit of honour, was starting to take a toll. Idomeneus would often place the welfare of his soldiers above his own well-being, pushing himself to exhaustion for the sake of the greater cause. And while his men admired his tenacity, some began to question whether a king could truly lead without first protecting himself. However, the gods had their own ideas about Idomeneus' fate. Like many heroes of the Trojan War, his destiny wasn't entirely his to control. Poseidon, the god of the sea and protector of sailors, seemed to favour Idomeneus, granting him protection during many of his voyages. But even Poseidon's favour couldn't shield him from the more unpredictable forces of the divine. With the gods watching from above, ready to intervene at any moment, Idomeneus' journey was already being shaped by forces he could neither understand nor escape. The Trojan War had stretched on for nearly a decade. The gods, ever meddlesome in the affairs of mortals, seemed as though they were amused by the spectacle of the Greeks and Trojans, each side believing it had the divine favour, only to be betrayed by their own weaknesses and overconfidence. For Idomeneus, the war had become a stage not just for battle but for internal conflict. His leadership had been tested, his courage proven, and his men had come to rely on him. But now, a moment was approaching that would challenge him in ways he'd never anticipated. As the Greeks were making their final push against Troy, the tension in the camp grew thick with exhaustion. The once grand ambitions of quickly conquering the city had long faded into an interminable struggle, where every victory felt hollow, and every setback pushed them further into despair. The Greek fleet had suffered heavy losses, and the ships, which had once seemed like a symbol of their strength, now appeared more like a looming reminder of their frailty. It was during this moment of frustration, when both the Greeks and Trojans were locked in a standstill, that a twist of fate would change everything for Idomeneus. After a particularly grueling skirmish outside the city walls, Idomeneus found himself standing with Agamemnon, Odysseus, and several other commanders. The conversation was tense, the mood heavy with the burden of prolonged war. The question was simple but profound. Should they push forward and risk everything for a final assault, or should they consider retreat? The Trojans were weakened but still formidable. A retreat, though, would be seen as a failure, a dishonour that could never be erased. It was a decision that would test not just their military resolve, but their very sense of identity as Greeks. Idomeneus, as always, argued for an aggressive stance. The island of Crete, after all, was not known for cowering in fear. He had led his men into battle with relentless resolve, and his belief was simple: if they fought harder, they would win. But the other leaders, weary from years of conflict, began to voice doubts. Odysseus, ever the pragmatist, pointed out the danger of continuing at such a cost, while Agamemnon warned of the possibility of divine punishment should they push too far. And then the gods, who had long been lurking in the background of the war, decided to make their presence felt. The sky darkened, and a sudden storm rolled over the Greeks' camp, as if to underscore the uncertainty of their fate. It was a sign, or perhaps a test. Poseidon, Idomeneus' divine protector, had granted him favour before, but in this moment even the god of the sea seemed distant. Apollo, another god with a vested interest in the outcome of the war, sent a prophetic message to the Greek leaders. It was cryptic but clear. The one who sacrifices the most will be the one who bears the heaviest burden. It was a warning Idomeneus took personally. To him, it was clear. He would lead his men, no matter the cost. He would carry the weight of his people, his kingdom, and his honour. But in the midst of this resolve, a choice had to be made, one that would alter the course of Idomeneus' life. The storm raged on for hours, and with it, the gods' voices grew louder. Eventually, Idomeneus was forced to make a fateful vow. I will sacrifice the first living being I see when I return to Crete, if only the gods would spare our fleet. It was a promise born out of desperation, a call to the gods in exchange for salvation. His words echoed through the camp like a prayer, but the cost of the vow was not immediately apparent. When the storm subsided, Idomeneus felt the weight of his promise. It wasn't just the loss of his men or his fleet at stake anymore, it was his very soul. But as always, the Greeks were quick to reassure him, focused solely on the task ahead. Troy was near defeat, and the gods would favour them in the final push. Idomeneus had no way of knowing that, in making that promise, he had already sealed his fate. The moment he uttered those words, he unwittingly set into motion a tragic chain of events that would follow him for the rest of his days. The gods may have spared his fleet, but the price would be far greater than he could imagine. The winds of fate, though seemingly invisible, were as powerful as the seas that Idomeneus had crossed countless times. Having made his vow to the gods, Idomeneus believed at first that it would be an act of duty, a necessary sacrifice for the greater good. After all, the gods had spared his fleet. The war was nearing its end, and the Greeks were on the brink of victory. Surely a simple offering to the gods in exchange for such salvation would be a small price to pay, right? But as the days passed and the journey home continued, the reality of his vow began to weigh heavily on his mind. Idomeneus had always been a man of honour, a man whose word was as unbreakable as the walls of his royal palace. He had always believed that duty to the gods and to his kingdom was paramount, but now, as the shores of Crete began to emerge on the horizon, he began to question the nature of that duty. The very gods who had granted him favour now seemed more like cruel architects of a fate he had no control over. His thoughts were plagued by doubt. What had he done? His mind, once as sharp as the sword he wielded in battle, now felt clouded with guilt. The first living thing he saw upon returning home, what if it was a child? What if it was someone he loved? How could he possibly fulfill the vow? The more he thought about it, the more he realized the terrible truth. His vow was no mere sacrifice of livestock or spoils of war. It was the sacrifice of something precious. It could be a person, a life. As the fleet sailed closer to Crete, Idomeneus found himself staring out into the horizon, unable to shake the grim thought that he had sealed his own fate. What if the gods demanded the ultimate sacrifice? What if his vow meant something darker than he had imagined? Would he have to sacrifice his own daughter? The thought was unbearable, but the possibility gnawed at him. It was here, in the solitude of his cabin, that Idomeneus wrestled with his inner turmoil. The cries of his men, celebrating the end of their long voyage, seemed distant to him now. They were too caught up in the excitement of their victory to understand the true cost of what had just transpired. But Idomeneus knew the stakes. He had never been one to back down from a challenge, but this was different. This wasn't a challenge on the battlefield. This was a test of his very soul. His mind began to flash back to his days as a young prince, raised in the courts of Crete under the watchful eye of his father. He remembered the lessons of duty, of the importance of leadership. Duty before all else. He had been taught that from an early age. He had always been willing to sacrifice for the good of his people, But now the line between duty and personal loss seemed blurry. Could he really uphold his vow without sacrificing his humanity? Could he sacrifice his own flesh and blood for the sake of honour? The gods were fickle, unpredictable in their favour. One moment they bestowed blessings, the next curses. Idomeneus knew better than most that the gods did not care for mortal suffering. They cared only for their own whims. But could a man like him, one who had always acted with honour, choose to break such a solemn vow? He thought of his daughter, Hippodamia, the child he loved more than anything. Her laughter echoed in his mind, the sound of innocence he could not bear to tarnish. And yet, the gods had seen fit to test him. The sacrifice he had promised, once a simple gesture to ensure survival, had now become a nightmare. He had to choose, keep his word to the gods, or defy the very promise he had made. As the ship neared the harbour, the weight of his decision became unbearable. He could not face it. He could not betray his daughter, nor could he betray his kingdom by going back on his word. The tension in his heart was a tempest more violent than any storm he had weathered at sea. And so, as the fleet dropped anchor and the soldiers began to disembark, Idomeneus stood still, paralysed by his indecision. The world around him seemed to blur into a haze, his thoughts spiralling deeper into confusion. How could he make a choice? But in the end there would be no more time for hesitation. The moment would come, and Idomeneus would have to face it. The gods, as ever, would have their way. And though Idomeneus had always been a man of resolve, it was this moment, this choice, that would define the rest of his life. The shores of Crete had never seemed so distant, and yet the moment of reckoning was fast approaching. Idomeneus stood at the prow of his ship, staring at the land that was once his sanctuary. He had been to battlefields, faced enemies, and survived countless hardships, but none of it had prepared him for the cruel test that awaited him on these very shores. The first living thing he saw would have to be sacrificed, just as he had promised the gods in exchange for the survival of his fleet. As the ships docked, the men of Crete rushed to disembark, eager to return to their families, to the peace that had long eluded them. But for Idomeneus, the celebration felt hollow. The men rejoiced, but the king stood frozen in place, his feet as heavy as stone. He could feel the weight of his vow like a suffocating blanket, pressing down on him with an intensity that made it difficult to breathe. His mind raced with the images of his daughter, the sweet face of Hippodamia, the child he had sworn to protect. But the gods had demanded their price, and fate had already been set into motion. The promise had been made, and the moment of reckoning had come. Idomeneus's heart pounded as he stepped off the ship, his eyes scanning the shores, looking for the first living thing to cross his path. It was almost cruel how ordinary the world seemed in that moment. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and the waves lapped gently against the shore, as if nature itself had no idea that the king was about to make a choice that would forever alter the course of his life. And then he saw her. Through the crowd of soldiers and villagers, the figure of Hippodamia emerged, her joyful face lighting up as she rushed toward him. Her laughter, once a comforting melody, now struck Idomeneus like a thunderclap. The first living thing he saw was his own daughter, the child he had promised to protect, the child whose love and devotion had been his guiding light through all the battles, all the struggles. Her eyes sparkled with excitement, unaware of the storm brewing in her father's heart. She reached out her arms to him, calling his name with the innocent trust only a child could have. "Father, you're home." For a moment, Idomeneus' resolve wavered. He looked at her, his beloved daughter, and felt an overwhelming rush of emotion. Love, guilt, and horror all mingled together. He wanted to run, to sweep her up in his arms and tell her everything was going to be okay. But in that instant, he was struck by the undeniable truth. He had made a vow to the gods. His word was the one thing he could not break. The gods had demanded a sacrifice, and he had no choice but to fulfill it. The weight of his duty, his honour, and his commitment to his people crushed him, and in that moment he understood the true cost of what he had promised. It wasn't just a sacrifice of life, it was the sacrifice of everything he held dear. Idomeneus knelt before Hippodamia, his hands trembling as he looked into her innocent eyes. "My dear child," he whispered, his voice choked with sorrow, "I have failed you, but the gods have spoken, and I must fulfill my vow." Before she could understand the full gravity of his words, before she could question the meaning of his grief, he raised his sword. The gods had demanded blood, and Diomedes, in his blind obedience, delivered it. The world seemed to collapse around him in that moment. As the life drained from Hippodamia's eyes, Diomedes felt as though a part of himself had died with her. The gods may have spared his fleet, but at what cost? He had fulfilled his vow, but in doing so, he had lost the very thing that made him human: his compassion, his love, his soul. The sound of the sacrifice echoed in the silent air, and the joyous celebration that had once filled the air turned into a haunting quiet. Diomedes stood over his daughter's lifeless body, unable to comprehend the enormity of what he had done. His soldiers, who had cheered him as a leader and a hero, now looked at him with eyes full of fear and confusion. They did not understand the burden he had carried. They did not understand the weight of the gods' demand. But the look in their eyes told Diomedes all he needed to know. He had just become a monster in their eyes. The gods may have spared his fleet, but Diomedes' sacrifice had come at the ultimate cost. His kingdom, once a beacon of prosperity, was now tainted by the blood of the innocent. The people of Crete could never look at him the same way again. They would never forgive him for the monstrous act he had committed in the name of duty and honour. The days following the sacrifice were filled with a deafening silence. The celebration of victory that had once rang through the streets of Crete now felt like a distant memory, drowned out by the crushing weight of Diomedes' decision. As the men of Crete returned to their homes, their families and their lives, the king remained alone in the palace, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what he had done. Diomedes' once bright future, marked by his leadership in the Trojan War, had now become a shadow of its former self. His soldiers, once loyal and eager to follow his command, now avoided his gaze. The kingdom, which had looked to him as a protector, now whispered behind his back, fearful of the man who had slaughtered his own flesh and blood in the name of duty. His royal lineage, once a source of pride, became a reminder of his failure. The man who had once been known for his courage and leadership was now known as the king who had sacrificed his daughter to the gods. As he sat alone in his grand hall, Diomedes realized the cost of his decision. The gods had not rewarded him with peace or triumph. They had given him only emptiness. His kingdom was no longer a place of prosperity. It was a kingdom haunted by his own actions. The people of Crete, who had once adored him, now looked upon him with fear and revulsion. His very name had become a curse. But there was no escaping the truth. Diomedes had fulfilled his vow to the gods, and in doing so, had lost everything. He had sacrificed the one thing he had sworn to protect. His daughter. There was no redemption in his future, no solace to be found in the praises of his people. The gods had played their part, but now they had moved on, leaving Diomedes to face the consequences alone. For days Diomedes wandered the halls of his palace, a shadow of the man he once was. He could not bear to face his people, and his thoughts were consumed by the image of his daughter's lifeless body. Every step he took felt like a betrayal of her memory, and yet there was no going back. He had made his choice, and the price of that choice was steep. In time, Diomedes made the painful decision to leave Crete. Exile, he realized, was the only way to escape the weight of his own guilt. There was no place for him in the kingdom he had once ruled. He could not bear the looks of disgust from his people, nor could he live with the knowledge that his actions had tainted the very land he had sworn to protect. So, he took one final look at the palace, the symbol of his past glory, and left it behind. As he sailed into the unknown, Diomedes felt the burden of his past slowly begin to ease, but the price of his redemption was clear. His legacy would be one of tragedy. He would never be remembered as the hero of Troy, the king who led Crete to victory. Instead, he would be remembered as the king who sacrificed his own daughter for the sake of a vow, a man whose honour became his downfall. But even in his exile, Diomedes did not escape the grasp of the gods. Some say he wandered the shores of distant lands, never finding peace. Others say he returned to Crete briefly, only to find the kingdom in ruins, a reflection of the ruin he had brought upon it. However, the final chapters of his life are lost to history, overshadowed by the tragedy of his actions. Still, his story remains. It is a tale of a king who sought to honour the gods, only to find that the cost of such honour was far greater than he had ever imagined. His legacy, like so many others in Greek mythology, is one of both greatness and ruin, a reminder that the gods, for all their promises, may demand more than even the bravest heroes can bear. As the years passed, the legend of Idomeneus faded into the shadows of history, a distant memory eclipsed by the louder tales of other Greek heroes. Yet, like all great tragedies, his story continued to linger in the hearts of those who remembered the price of blind duty and unflinching honour. Idomeneus, the once proud king of Crete, became a symbol, not of greatness, but of the catastrophic consequences of a leader's actions when weighed down by impossible vows. In some versions of his myth, Idomeneus returns to Crete in his final years, a man broken by the ghosts of his past. The palace where he had once ruled with confidence now seemed like an alien place to him, and the people of Crete who had once adored him could not look past the blood that stained his hands. His exile, which had seemed like a release at first, only deepened his sense of isolation. Idomeneus was no longer a king. He was a wandering figure, lost in the vastness of his own guilt, unable to reclaim the life he had thrown away. There are others who suggest a more poetic end, that Idomeneus sailed from Crete, never to return, wandering the seas in search of redemption that would never come. In this version, he becomes a tragic figure, a king whose own sense of honour had led him into a self-imposed exile, where the price of his actions remained with him to the very end. It is said that he lived out his final days in sorrow, contemplating the actions that had taken the most precious thing from him, his daughter, and that, in his solitude, he became a symbol of the human condition, the conflict between duty and love, the burden of sacrifice, and the cost of promises made in desperation. No matter how his final years are told, one thing is certain. Idomeneus' legacy remains one of loss, not glory. His name is not remembered as that of a heroic king who led his people to victory or even a wise ruler who brought prosperity to Crete. Instead, he is remembered as a man who was undone by his own sense of duty, a king who made the ultimate sacrifice only to lose his soul in the process. In the grand tapestry of Greek myth, where gods, heroes, and mortals intertwine, Idomeneus' story is a stark reminder of the fragility of even the mightiest men. His tragedy lies not in his battlefield victories, which were numerous, or his status as a leader among the Greeks. His tragedy lies in the depths of his moral struggle, in the hollow promises he made to the gods, and in the irrevocable loss he endured. The gods may have spared his fleet, but they did not spare his heart. His myth is often recounted as a cautionary tale for kings, warriors, and those who would risk their souls in the name of duty. It teaches that the pursuit of honour, when taken to extremes, can destroy everything one holds dear. Idomeneus, for all his courage and nobility, was a man who lost everything not in battle, but in the quiet corners of his conscience. And though the warriors who followed him may have looked to him for guidance, they would never forget the tragic price he paid for his commitment to the gods. Ultimately, Idomeneus' legacy is not one of grandeur, but one of caution. His name is etched not in the marble halls of glory, but in the ruins of his kingdom, the ruins of his heart. And as the centuries passed, his tale would remain a testament to the fragility of human nature, the tension between duty and love, and the unforgiving consequences of promises made in the heat of desperation.